The fastest way to stay poor for life is not to borrow money. It is to fear all debt equally. That is the lie. That is the expensive lie. That is the lie that keeps decent, hard-working, disciplined people sending money to the wrong places for 20 years and calling it responsibility while their future quietly starves behind them. Most people think debt is one ugly pile: mortgage, car, student loans, credit cards, personal loans. They throw all of it into one emotional bucket and say, "I just want it gone." That sounds mature, that sounds disciplined, that sounds safe. It is often financial self-destruction in slow motion, because debt is not one thing. Debt is a spectrum of cost, a spectrum of flexibility, a spectrum of danger. Some debt is a cheap servant. Some debt is a silent assassin. And if you do not know the difference, you will spend your strongest dollars killing the wrong enemy while the real one keeps bleeding you every month. That is where I want to begin. Not with a budgeting rule, with capital triage. If you want the mother line for everything I am about to tell you, here it is. The way real wealth gets built is not by becoming debt-free at any cost. It is by learning the difference between cheap debt that can coexist with wealth building and toxic debt that must be destroyed immediately, then routing every extra dollar toward the highest long-term return instead of toward whatever debt happens to make you feel anxious first. That is the line. Read it again. Because once you understand it, you stop asking the wrong question. You stop asking, how fast can I pay everything off? You stop asking, wouldn't tea being debt-free just make me feel better? You stop asking, is tea any debt always bad? You start asking the adult question, which dollar buys me the biggest increase in freedom from here? The dollar used to kill toxic interest, or the dollar used to build ownership while cheap debt quietly sits in the background? That is the real question. That is the profitable question. That is the question most people never ask because they were trained by emotion, by parents, by slogans, and by fear instead of by mathematics. I learned very early that money does not reward emotional neatness. It rewards intelligent allocation. A person can be technically debt-free and still be structurally poor. No assets, no cash flow, no compounding engine, no ownership, no buffer. Just a clean slate and a weak future. Another person can carry low-cost debt, own appreciating assets, collect dividends, fund retirement accounts, and quietly get wealthier every year. One looks morally pure. The other looks financially intelligent. The market does not pay for purity. The market pays for structure. That is the whole game. Now, let me say something harder. A lot of people are not poor because they lack income. They are poor because their capital routing is childish. They see every spare dollar as a relief button, throw it at the nearest balance, feel virtuous, repeat. That is not strategy. That is nervous system management. A nervous system does not build wealth. A system does. That is why I want to take this whole debt question apart, the way it actually works, not as a guilt story, not as a good debt, bad debt, cliché, as a decision architecture. Because once you get the architecture right, the rest of your financial life changes shape. Now let me take you into the first mechanism. I call it the cost of capital law. This is the foundation. Miss this, and everything else becomes confused. Every debt has a cost. Every dollar you have also has a potential return. The only serious question is this: which side of that comparison is stronger? If a debt costs you 3.5% and the capital you would use to pay it down can reasonably earn 8%, 10%, or 12% over time, then throwing extra money at that debt is not prudence. It is a hidden loss. You are accepting a low guaranteed return by avoiding interest instead of buying a much larger probable return elsewhere. That is what most people never stop to calculate. They do not ask what the dollar could earn. They only ask what the debt feels like. Feelings are expensive. The reference document says this very directly in its own way. People keep lumping debt together instead of understanding the true cost of money. And that confusion destroys wealth, building potential over long periods. Faithful site Fay turn 61 file 0 Fay. Exactly. That is the cost of capital law. If your dollar can work harder somewhere else without taking foolish risk, then your first job is not to erase every balance. It is to deploy that dollar where it produces the strongest total result. This is how businesses think. This is how investors think. This is how intelligent households must learn to think if they want to stop treating finance like a moral purity test. The world keeps teaching people a childish sentence. All debt is bad. All debt is consequential. That is different. Some consequences are acceptable, even useful, because the capital preserved by not overpaying cheap debt can be redirected into stronger assets. Some consequences are deadly, because the interest rate is so high that it eats future returns faster than most households can outgrow it. That is why I say debt must be triaged, not hated indiscriminately. The cost of capital law is what separates adults from amateurs. An amateur asks, "How do I feel about this debt?" An adult asks, "What is this debt costing me? What could this money earn elsewhere? And what path leaves me richer 10 years from now?" Those are different minds. They get very different results. Now let me take you into the second mechanism. I call it the cheap money trap. This one surprises people because the word trap sounds negative, but the danger here is not the debt itself. The danger is overreacting to cheap debt and accidentally starving your wealth engine while congratulating yourself for being responsible. The reference document starts with low interest mortgages for a reason. It says plainly that if you locked in something like 2.5 to 4% over the last decade, that may be some of the cheapest money you will ever access in your life, and aggressively prepaying, it can be mathematically inferior to investing. File site, turn 61, file 0 that is right. A low interest fixed mortgage is not a fire. It is a long-term contract priced in a world that no longer exists. If you already have that contract, and if the rate is low enough, it can be one of the cheapest pools of capital you will ever control. People do not like hearing that because they were taught to worship the phrase paid off house. Fine, a paid off house feels good. It is not automatically the best capital allocation. That is the point. Let us say you owe money at 3.5%. If every extra dollar thrown at principal earns you an effective 3.5% by avoiding future interest, while a diversified long-term ownership strategy can reasonably do much better over time. Then what are you actually doing? You are not becoming safer in the most intelligent sense. You are moving money from a flexible asset, building path into illiquid home equity, and calling the emotional relief a financial victory. That is the cheap money trap. The reference document phrases this bluntly by saying that cheap, low-interest debt should never receive an extra dollar beyond required payments when higher return opportunities exist. The tone is theatrical, but the structural point is sound. File site turn 61 file 0 Now let me add the part most people forget. A dollar sent to extra mortgage principal does not vanish. It turns into equity. Good. But equity locked inside a house is not the same as liquid capital growing in an investment account. One gives you optionality, the other gives you a bigger brick wall around the same address. Optionality matters, liquidity matters. A person who has cheap debt and growing investments is very different from a person who crushed the cheap debt early and now owns a bigger percentage of a house while having less market exposure, less cash, and less compounding outside the property. This is why I say the issue is not whether housing is good. Housing may be wonderful. The issue is sequencing. Asset engine first, cheap debt can sit quietly in the background. That is the richer order. Now let me be careful. I am not saying everyone should borrow recklessly. I am not saying go buy more house. I am not saying leverage is a religion. I am saying if the cheap debt already exists, attacking it aggressively may be one of the cleanest ways to feel disciplined while actually staying smaller than you needed to stay. That is the cheap money trap, and it catches a great many people because it flatters their virtue. Now let me take you into the third mechanism. I call it the early decade window. This is where the student loan conversation gets so often mishandled because people treat student debt only as a balance to a race instead of also seeing the years around it as the most valuable investing years of life. The reference document makes the right observation here. It says many people in their 20s and 30s throw every spare dollar at federal student loans while building no retirement base at all, and in doing so they sacrifice the highest compounding years of their lives. File site turn 61 file 0 that is exactly right. A dollar invested at 25 is not the same as a dollar invested at 45. The younger dollar gets more decades, more reinvestment, more time, more invisible multiplication. That is why the early years matter so violently, and this is why I get frustrated when people make student loans into a moral drama instead of a capital allocation problem. A fixed federal student loan at 4%, 5%, even 6% is not pleasant. Fine, it still may not be the first place every extra dollar belongs if that dollar could capture an employer match. Build a Roth account or begin compounding decades earlier. The reference text says this explicitly: take the employer match first because that is free money, then build reserves, then invest tax advantaged, and only after that think differently about making extra payments. Fay-Falicite Fay-Turn 61 File 0 Fay. Yes, because free money beats debt aversion every time. A 50% or 100% match is not just nice, it is mathematically dominant. And the years of compounding in a retirement account are not decorative. They are the core of later freedom. This is why I call it the early decade window. It is a window in which each invested dollar is much more powerful than it will be later. Closing that window so you can pay down medium. Cost debt faster may still feel noble. It often leaves you poorer. Now let me say something sharper. There are really two questions around federal student loans. First, how toxic is the interest rate? Second, how strong are the protections and flexibility attached to the debt? Federal student loans are not the same as private student loans that matters: income-driven repayment options, deferrals, potential forgiveness structures. Those things change the nature of the burden. The reference document points to exactly this distinction, and that distinction is essential. Fay-Falicite Fay-Turn 61 File 0 Fay. A debt with moderate cost and structural flexibility is not the same enemy as a high-rate revolving balance that grows mercilessly and offers you almost no strategic room. That is why blanket kill-it-all advice is so sloppy. If a 27-year-old is sacrificing a Roth IRA, an employer match, and an emergency fund to make triple payments on moderate federal loans, that person is not becoming free. That person is burning the early decade window. That is a tragedy. Not because paying debt is bad, because those years do not come back. Now let me take you into the fourth mechanism. I call it the depreciating asset confusion. This is the auto loan question, and it is where people's instincts become especially unreliable because the car itself is losing value, so they assume the financing should be crushed as fast as possible. Again, too simple. The reference text says this directly. If the auto loan rate is low enough, then extra principal payments may still be inferior to investing the difference, even though the underlying asset is depreciating. Fay-Falicite Fay-Turn 61 File 0 Fay. That is the part people miss. The car depreciating and the financing cost are related, yes, but they are not the same decision. The car was already bought. The relevant question now is what to do with the next dollar. If the financing cost is 3.5%, and the next dollar could reasonably earn more elsewhere over time, then the existence of depreciation does not automatically change the math. It changes the emotional tone. People hate owing money on something that falls in value. Fine. But dislike is not a formula. This is why I call it the depreciating asset confusion. People let the nature of the asset distort the logic of the capital decision. A low-rate car loan can still be cheap money. If it is cheap money, then extra dollars thrown at it may still be weaker than dollars sent to ownership assets. The reference document gives a straightforward numerical example of this, comparing extra payments on a low-rate auto loan versus investing the same amount. The numbers are simplified, but the framework is correct. Fay-Falicite Fay-Turn 61 File 0 Fay. Now let me add the necessary warning. I am not defending expensive car debt. I am not defending oversized vehicles. I am not defending bad purchases. If the rate is high, the car is unaffordable, or the buyer used financing to create a fake identity, that is another matter entirely. But if the loan is already in place, the rate is low, and the budget is solid, then emotional urgency around owning it outright can still lead to mediocre capital allocation. That is the real lesson. Not car loans are good. The lesson is that a cheap liability attached to a depreciating asset can still be less dangerous than an undisciplined refusal to invest. That is a subtle point. Subtle points are where wealth lives. Now, let me take you into the fifth mechanism. I call it the free return ladder. This is where the conversation must become constructive, because it is not enough to say what not to overpay. You must know exactly what the freed capital should do instead. The reference document lays out a hierarchy. And while I would phrase it in my own way, the hierarchy is directionally sound, captured the employer 401, K-match, build emergency reserves, fund tax, advantaged accounts, and then continue directing money toward assets that compound file site turn 61, file 0 that is the free return ladder. And it begins with one brutally simple truth. If your employer offers matching money and you are not taking it, you are not being conservative. You are rejecting one of the highest certainty returns available to you. That is nonsense. Take the match every time. First, before admiration, before ideology, before elaborate debt purity. Take the match, then build protection. 3 to 6 months of expenses in accessible cash is not glamorous. Good. It is not supposed to be. It is there so high interest debt does not come roaring back the moment life behaves like life. Then tax shelters, Roth IRA if eligible, 401k if appropriate. Whatever legally protected compounding vehicle fits the plan. Why? Because the market may give you ordinary returns. Yes, but the tax code can meaningfully change what you keep. That matters. Then, ownership assets beyond that, index funds, dividend growers, broad equity exposure, maybe later specific businesses or concentrated opportunities, if you truly know what you are doing. The reference text emphasizes dividends strongly. Find my own view is broader. What matters most is disciplined ownership of productive assets, bought with a long horizon and a rational structure. Still, the file is right that the money should be redirected into assets, not left idle. File site turn 61 file 0 that is the free return ladder. It forces every extra dollar to climb from the highest certainty return down toward the next most rational deployment. This is what adults do. They route money. They do not merely spend it or send it away to the balance that looks ugliest. Now let me say something harder. Most people do not have a debt problem first. They have a routing problem, they free up cash, and then let it disappear into lifestyle. That is why I am so forceful about the ladder. If you do not give the dollar a higher mission immediately, it gets absorbed by ordinary life. Ordinary life is a talented thief. The ladder prevents that theft. Now let me take you into the sixth mechanism. I call it the wealth engine rule. This is the deepest philosophical error in the whole debt conversation. People keep mistaking debt elimination for wealth creation. They are not the same thing related, sometimes still not the same. A person can eliminate all cheap debt and build no engine. A person can carry cheap debt and build a serious engine. Guess which person gets free first? The reference document says this quite openly near the end. Being debt free is not the goal. Being wealthy is the goal. That sentence, stripped of its showmanship, is one of the most important in the entire file. File site turn 61 file 0 Exactly. Wealth is assets. Cash flow, optionality, compounding, liquidity, ownership, not the mere absence of balances. A household with no debt but no assets is not wealthy. It is fragile in a cleaner looking way. A household with cheap debt, strong reserves, a funded retirement system, dividend income, market ownership, and a long runway is much stronger. That is why I call it the wealth engine rule. Your job is not to achieve numerical purity. Your job is to build an engine that gets stronger while you age. That engine can tolerate certain forms of cheap debt. In fact, sometimes it uses them intelligently. This is where so many people get emotionally offended. They want morality. I want arithmetic. If the debt is cheap and the asset engine is strong, the presence of debt does not disprove wealth. If the debt is expensive and the asset engine is weak, the absence of luxury spending does not prove wisdom. The wealth engine rule asks only one serious question. Is the structure producing growing claims on the future? That is the question. Not does it feel clean? Not would my grandparents approve? Not can I say I owe nothing? Those are emotionally satisfying questions. They are not the best wealth building questions. Now let me take you into the seventh mechanism. I call it the debt cancer line. This is where everything becomes very simple very quickly. Because once we leave cheap debt and enter high-interest consumer debt, the debate ends. The reference document is absolutely right here. Credit cards, personal loans, buy now, pay, ladder balances, payday-style debt, anything in the double digits. Especially the high teens and 20s belongs in a different category entirely. The file calls it financial cancer. The phrase is dramatic, the math is still right. Fay file site, Fay turn, 61 file, 0 Fay, that is the debt cancer line. Above this line, the cost of capital is usually too high for ordinary investing to outrun reliably. Above this line, the debt is not a servant. It is an extraction machine. And once you are feeding that machine, the rest of the conversation becomes secondary. This is why I have no patience for people trying to sound sophisticated while carrying revolving balances at 22% and arguing about whether they should invest in index funds. Number not yet. Kill the cancer first. You are not building wealth while this is alive. You are donating future freedom to a compounding predator. That is what the line means. Once a debt crosses into these rates, the guaranteed return from eliminating it usually dominates the long-term expected return from most sensible investments. That is the truth. No romance, no nuance, destroy it. Now I want to be precise. The debt cancer line is not exactly the same for every person in every situation. But the principle holds at some sufficiently high cost of debt, the argument for investing instead of paying it down collapses. The reference document places that practical cutoff around 8% for its own framework and becomes especially aggressive. Once rates move into the high teens and 20s, that is reasonable as a simplified household rule. Fay falecite, Fay turn, 61, file 0 Fay here is what matters. Below the line, think, compare, root intelligently. Above the line, attack, no confusion, no performance, no delay disguised as sophistication. This is where the avalanche method makes sense. Highest rate first, burn it down, then the next. Then the next, you can use a snowball if you absolutely need psychological momentum. Yes, but the mathematics of interest remain what they are. The debt does not care about your story, it cares about the rate. That is why I call it the debt cancer line. It clarifies the whole field. Cheap debt is a tool. Moderate debt is contextual. Toxic debt is a war. Now let me step back and show you the whole machine. First, understand the cost of capital. Second, stop overfeeding cheap debt. Third, protect the early compounding years from medium cost balances when stronger opportunities exist. Fourth, do not let the emotional ugliness of a depreciating asset distort a rational capital decision. Fifth, root free dollars up the highest return ladder instead of letting them leak into lifestyle. Sixth, remember that debt elimination is not wealth creation unless it strengthens the engine. Seventh, attack toxic consumer debt with total seriousness, that is the machine. And once you see the whole machine, most personal finance slogans start looking embarrassingly simplistic. All debt is bad. Number, pay everything off fast. Number, invest everything. Also, no think triage wrote, build, destroy the right enemy first. That is the rule. Now, let me make the identity flip explicit. Most people think the financially responsible person is the one who sends every extra dollar to debt. That is too small. The real adult is the one who can tell the difference between a cheap obligation that can coexist with compounding and a toxic obligation that is eating the future alive, then acts accordingly without confusing virtue with results. That is the flip. A nervous person asks, how do I get rid of balances? A builder asks, how do I strengthen the whole structure? A nervous person wants relief. A builder wants return. A nervous person seeks emotional cleanliness. A builder seeks long-term freedom. Those are different minds. They end up in different worlds. Now, let me bring the operating system together in plain language. First, sort debt by interest rate and flexibility instead of emotion. Second, stop making extra payments on low-interest debt when stronger long-term returns are available. Third, never sacrifice employer match, emergency reserves, or early compounding years to medium cost debt without understanding the trade-off. Fourth, build an explicit routing ladder for every extra dollar. Fifth, stop confusing debt-free with wealthy. Sixth, draw a hard line above which debt becomes an emergency to destroy, not a balance to manage casually. That is the operating system. Not guilt, not debt worship, not anti-debt religion. Capital triage. Now, let me put the blade into this as cleanly as I can. The three debts most people should stop aggressively paying down are not dangerous because debt is secretly wonderful. They should stop because cheap money, moderate structured debt, and wealth, building capital are not interchangeable, and every extra dollar misrouted toward the wrong balance can cost years of compounding that never come back. That is the truth. And if you remember nothing else from what I said, remember this. The goal is not to die with no balances. The goal is to live with an engine strong enough that balances are understood, assets are growing, toxic debt is dead, and your money works harder than your fear. That is how you stop being responsible in the ordinary sense and start becoming rich in the real one.